All right, well, let's kick off. So welcome everyone to the first webinar in our series of 4 that we're doing on the performance gap. So we've broken the topic down, as you can imagine, it's a reasonably chunky topic. We've broken it down into 4 sort of categories. First up, obviously, we're sort of looking at what is the issue. So what is the performance gap and why you really need to consider performance right up front in the design stage. For our second webinar, we are going to be looking at where sustainability rating tools come into the picture and why they're so useful in this space. I know it sounds biased, but it's true, they're really useful. Number 3, we are looking at a really interesting case study and doing a deep dive into how the New South Wales government, in this case, has used some really interesting research findings and has created a piece of policy that's really squarely trying to tackle the performance gap. For our 4th session, we are doing what we're hoping is going to be a really, really practical session. So you'll have learned everything along the way. You'll sort of see what the issue is, where rating tools come in, how the New South Wales government is using that knowledge, and putting it all together and getting some really practical takeaways to go and implement some things yourself. So we'll start obviously with an acknowledgement of country. So we acknowledge that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are the first peoples and traditional custodians of Australia and the oldest continuing culture in human history. We pay respect to elders past and present and commit to respecting the lands we walk on and the communities that we walk with. So to get started, obviously it's not a surprise to many people in this room, but what happens when you don't consider performance in the design stage is, of course, the performance gap. So the performance gap is essentially the difference between the amount of energy that we think a building will use when we design it, when we predict that, versus how much it actually uses once it starts operating. And again, it won't be a surprise, but there is really consistently a significant gap between those 2 figures. So the numbers vary, and there are a lot of really interesting reasons why, which we'll cover off a little bit. But around 25% is the sort of common figure that we see. And there are some really terrifying figures as well. So we see like 250%, one study found 380% for some buildings. So, you know, a lot of variation, but the key takeaway is that whatever the study is, there is always a performance gap. So when we zoom into Australia, I'll just start by saying that there's some amazing studies, but the overarching theme is that data is really hard to come by. And what I mean by that is that the data we have tends to be from people who actually really care about this issue. So they're kind of doing all the right things. So they are, you know, trying to measure how much energy they'll be using when they're eventually performing, and they're actually measuring that once they start operating. So to be doing both of those things, you're actually looking at projects that have sustainability targets and have an interest in sustainability. So we've got great data, but I will say it's a little bit skewed. So the study that I'm looking at here is by the Green Building Council of Australia, who manage Green Star ratings. So we're looking at Green Star projects, which of course do have this data. So when they first did the study in 2013, they found an average 25% gap between how much energy these buildings thought they would use versus how much they actually used. In fantastic news, when they redid the study in 2021, that gap is starting to close. So when you know the gap's there and you target it, you can start to close it. So really happy note to start the webinar. In the most recent 2021 study, we're looking at 67% of Green Star projects achieving or exceeding their targeted star rating. So that's a pretty great outcome realistically. But what we can see there is obviously these are sustainability focused buildings and they're high performance buildings, and we actually still have a little bit of a gap. So we can pretty safely assume that there is a much broader barrier in the wider market to achieving some emissions reductions goals in this sector. Look, it's pretty obvious, but why does it matter? Essentially, the built environment and buildings are responsible for a really large portion of Australia's emissions. The figure changes, obviously, looking at the scope, but we're looking at a big figure, sort of how will we cut it? We've just learned that buildings actually use a lot more energy than we think they will. We've all got net zero targets at all levels of government. And to make sure that we're on track to hit them, or we've got any chance of hitting them, we actually really need to make sure that buildings are doing what they're supposed to do and what we think they will do. So we need to make sure that they comply with the minimum standards set out in the National Construction Code, and also go above and beyond whenever we can. So we'll do a bit of a deeper dive into the research to sort of try and get across it a bit more. So the first study is the one I just mentioned before. So it's done by the Green Building Council of Australia, who manage Green Star ratings. Obviously, we're looking at design versus performance. And as I said, we're looking at, you might call them high-end officers. So we're looking at people who really care about this stuff. The best finding from this is obviously that the gap closes when targeted. And of course, they've come up with some recommendations to address the gap more broadly. But to me, the biggest takeout, and this is obviously a quote here, is that we're looking at 14% of the market here, and we've got great results in this sector. So to make sure that we're achieving the same results at scale, we really need to transfer these lessons beyond this segment of the market. So that means to mid-tier offices, but also to other sectors as well. So in terms of the data from that project, this is the entire data set. So this is all 176 office buildings in the study. So 23% exceeded the target. So that's pretty amazing. Like, that's really exciting. And 44% achieved their target. So that's our 67% doing great things. 21% missed the mark, but actually weren't that far off. So with a little bit of tweaking and tuning, likely to get there at some point. And 12% missed the mark. So, by whatever figure that is, but we're looking at a performance gap in that cohort for sure. Now, this is where, to me, it gets really interesting. So there's a smaller cohort within the study who had a Green Star rating, but also a NABERS commitment agreement. So you use these tools together and you can use a commitment agreement to get points in your Green Star credits. But of the buildings that had a commitment agreement, we start to see some really, really cool results. So 91% of buildings with commitment agreements met or exceeded their target off the bat, which is great, so no performance gap. And really, really excitingly, only one building in this cohort didn't hit the target at peak performance. So with some amount of sort of commissioning for a few years there. So we're looking at, this is a really effective way to close the gap. So we'll go into a bit more detail later. The other study that we looked at is the IPEC report. And we've looked at that because essentially it's an international review looking at performance gap studies from around the world. And this, I showed you a few of the figures before, but there's quite a range of figures, and based on some of what we've said about the Green Building Council study, we can sort of assume that there may be similar issues. So buildings collecting this data may have more of an interest in this space anyway. But essentially, the report has said that the performance gap is there globally, and it's a significant barrier in terms of policy goals. Sorry. All right, so I won't go into detail about the actual figures themselves, but you can see that there's, a range of figures, and that there are sort of various green building systems listed here as well. So that to me says that, we may have some of the data sort of skewing that we've got in Australia as well. But some of those figures have some really terrifying studies, which may be looking at sort of the broader market. So causes for the performance gap, I won't go through all of them, obviously, I'm sure it's a small section of them anyway. But the key message is that they can occur through any phase of sort of a building life cycle. So some examples in the design phase, it's really easy to be over-optimistic about how a piece of technology might perform. And most people will design a building to operate in perfect conditions, and that's how they assume it will operate. Obviously, we know, it's the real world, and that's not quite what happens. So, we have heat waves. We've got quite a lot of heat waves predicted for the future. Buildings don't always operate as they should do in ideal conditions. The other interesting thing is that it's often not a quality assurance process sort of for all buildings, particularly in terms of the energy modelling. And it's really easy to sort of miss small figures or sort of be over-optimistic, whatever it is. And having somebody pick those things up is a really easy way to sort of close the performance gap from this section. In the construction phase, not following manufacturer's design guides or installation guides is a key one. Not paying as much attention during construction is a key one. In terms of operation, like controls are probably a common one too. So, the old example was that you would design a building for all the, with all the lights that turn off automatically at 7 o'clock, for example. But, when you get to operation, it turns out the controls can't do that. And you're relying on someone flicking off the switch, which is not, certainly not as effective. When it comes to recommendations, very conveniently, both studies have them and they line up quite well. So the GBCA report pulled out NABERS commitment agreements, so there's a really key factor there. Monitoring and managing, so understanding, accurately predicting how much energy you should be using, and monitoring that once the building's operational, making sure that you're referencing back and picking up issues before they become a performance gap. And of course, broadening the scope and taking the lessons and applying them throughout the broader market. When it comes to the IPEC study, it's a bit more specific. So they've suggested improved modelling quality, better management of quality control throughout the life cycle of the building, greater transparency of operational energy performance. We didn't even realise this until the end, but we picked up they actually reference NABERS there, which is pretty cool. And we've got a really great case study next on that. And the last one is outcome-based policies regulating operational performance. And our second case study looks at that one. So our first case study, interestingly, is not actually focused on design, but it is a really interesting case study that has had a really significant impact on the design of new buildings and having them consider performance right from the get-go. So we're looking at the commercial building disclosure scheme, and the recommendation that this is linked to is greater transparency of operational energy performance. So the commercial building disclosure scheme is actually an act, so it's legislated. And at its most basic, it requires a public NABERS rating for offices leasing or selling 1,000 square meters of office space. So to me, what's really fascinating is that there's no minimum target. So buildings aren't required to perform at any particular level, but essentially having to get a rating and know that that will be public is a really significant motivator to improve your performance over time. And what this does is, if anyone's building an office building, they know they're going to get one of these ratings. They know they'll be competing with people with good ratings, and they're sort of, encouraged, really encouraged to focus on performance really early on in the design stage and take a genuine approach to making sure that translates into real world performance because it's verified. So this graph is, to me, really interesting, but I'm a data nerd. But I'll run you through it and hopefully you'll find it interesting as well at the end. So we've got three sort of cohorts here, and I'll run you through two. But the first cohort is this grey line. And you might call these buildings early adopters. So they started getting NABERS ratings before they were legally required to, so before the commercial building disclosure scheme came into effect. And they mostly did it to capitalise on government tenants. So government tenants had policies saying that they were targeting buildings with a minimum 4 or 4.5 star NABERS rating. So essentially these buildings started rating in order to attract those tenants. And when they started rating, you can see they've got an average energy intensity of about 600 megajoules per meter squared. So they start rating, fast forward 5 years, in 2011, they've decreased their energy intensity to 500 megajoules per meter squared. So it's about a 15% decrease in a really short space of time. So that's pretty impressive off the bat. And at that point, the commercial building disclosure scheme comes into effect, and our second cohort of buildings are legally required to start getting ratings as well. So when they start rating, you can see their energy intensity is over 650 megajoules per meter squared, so even higher than the early cohort was when they started rating, 5 years previously, and a lot higher than the early cohort is at that point in time. But really amazingly to me, you then fast forward another 9 years, and not only has the gap between the two closed significantly, but there's a 35% decrease in energy intensity, and that's on average, of course. So that's a really, really rapid rate of decrease. I think it's one of the fastest of any sector anywhere in the world. So it's really amazing results. And essentially that's a focus on operational performance and disclosure of operational performance. So our second case study is very specific to the performance gap, and it's a brand new policy looking at targeting the performance gap through the planning system. So I'm talking about the New South Wales Sustainable Building SEP. And for anyone not familiar with the New South Wales planning system, the SEP is a state environmental planning policy. So it's legislated, just like the CBD Act. And we're linked to two research recommendations, one from each study. We're looking at IPEC's recommendation for outcome-based policies regulating operational performance. And we're looking at GBCA's recommendation to commit to NABERS. So, and I don't have graphs here for this one, I'm really sorry. Good news for people who aren't into data and sad news for me. So the Sustainable Building SEP is a brand new policy, and it's actually so new that it's not actually live until the 1st of October. So we're talking brand new, but it's a really interesting policy. So it's designed to link design and performance. And it does this by focusing on the very early design stage and having people legally commit to an operational performance rating. So it does this via the planning system. So obviously it's an existing framework and it's already multiple touch points. And it also utilizes NABERS, which is useful for a number of reasons, but also it's known by the industry and it's independent and trusted as well. So at its heart, the Sustainable Building SEP requires people to sign up to getting a performance rating once the building is operational, acknowledging that that operational rating will be public, and agreeing to compliance mechanisms if they don't hit the target. So if you don't meet the required targets, you will be required to pay sort of offsets for the difference, carbon offsets, and there's also potential financial penalties as well. So it's all really interesting, and so the performance levels are linked to the National Construction Code standards, but these requirements are actually for large commercial buildings. So obviously, the policy is designed to minimise energy use and emissions, but it's also really interestingly, not super relevant to this presentation, but really amazingly, it's actually got a requirement for reporting on embodied carbon as well. So just a really interesting note that this is, a great policy that's sort of leading the market in a few ways. So obviously we've touched on a few solutions already, but we've sort of summarised them into some really practical strategies that people are already using and that we know are working. So we're looking at standards, so outcome-based policies and sort of thresholds for performance. We're obviously looking at disclosure and encouraging competition as well. Better quality energy modelling, independent quality assurance processes that will pick up issues and improve designs, essentially before it's too late and too expensive to pick them up. So once construction started or a building has been built, it's actually really expensive to go back and fix things up if they're only picked up at that stage. And verification is really key. So that might be sort of conditioning and tuning, like in the Green Building Council study. So knowing how much energy, for example, your air conditioning system should be using, and seeing if you're actually using a lot more than that, what has gone wrong, is there a defect, is a setting wrong, like making sure that you know what something should be doing and picking up issues before they become performance gaps. And obviously measuring and disclosing operational performance once the building is complete as well. So where does NABERS come in? Obviously, I've been scattering term commitment agreements throughout this. So I'll go into a little bit more detail about what that is and sort of the broader NABERS piece as well. So as I said, NABERS is a government tool, really quite uniquely for a sustainability rating tool. We primarily focus on existing buildings, and we do that through performance ratings. So they are obviously all the data points that make up the graph for the commercial building disclosure scheme that I showed you. So that's the bulk of our work, and that's really quite unusual for a sustainability rating scheme. The other section of our work is design and performance ratings. So they are design ratings, so they're designed for new buildings, but their primary goal is to close the performance gap. So to get buildings to perform as designed. So we've got two key tools for new and renovating buildings. The first one is a NABERS commitment agreement. So this is our oldest design tool. So it's been around for quite a while, got a lot of data on them. And essentially it's a contractual commitment to deliver a building that doesn't use more energy than it's supposed to. So they're for energy only at the moment. You can use them for a new building or a refurbishment or an addition. Great quote from the Green Building Council report. So that they were a critical success factor in translating design intentions into real-world outcomes. And to me, this is because there's multiple stages of independent verification. And like I said, energy modelling is really detailed. It's really quite technical. So it's really easy for a small mistake to have a big impact. So having an independent review of that before construction can start just means that any design issues, any energy modelling mistakes can be picked up and addressed before construction starts and before it becomes too expensive to fix. And obviously, of course, there's a performance rating once the building's built as well. So it's very obvious, you know, if the loop has been closed and the target's been met. Our second design tool is called an agreement to rate. So it's a much newer tool. So I don't have nice graphs, I'm sorry. But essentially it's been designed for policymakers. So it is a contract that signs developers or signs someone building a new building up to getting a performance rating once the building is complete. And acknowledging that the outcomes of that performance rating will be public so that policymakers can see the outcome and verify it against whatever target they set. So the key differences between them, I suppose the best one to me is that commitment agreements have sort of an inbuilt quality assurance framework, whereas an agreement to rate works within its own policy framework. So it works within an external policy framework that has its own sort of checks and compliance measures. A commitment agreement is also a tool that's sort of voluntarily used by builders and developers a lot because it allows them to market the future performance of the building and set a target rating that they can advertise, whereas an agreement to rate doesn't let you set a target and doesn't let you market sort of future performance. So obviously commitment agreements have sort of standards and rules for energy modelling that are reviewed and signed off before construction can begin, while agreements to rate rely on sort of external processes. The downside of a commitment agreement is that it's currently energy only and it is more expensive because of those frameworks, whereas an agreement to rate can include energy, water, environment, waste, embodied carbon, or any combination of them. So you can get a much broader scope, and they are cheaper to register for as well. So in terms of outcomes, we did see some from the Green Building Council study, our data that too. So 91% of buildings hit their target within 2 ratings, 36% overachieve off the bat as well. So that's really exciting. That's the opposite of the performance gap. And over 98% hit the target peak performance, which is the stat from that Green Building Council study as well. So I won't go through the process in a huge amount of detail, but the reason I put this slide up is because I think most people in this room are policymakers of some description. And as policymakers, our influence often drops away at some point throughout the process. So maybe that's, if you sort of work with the planning system, maybe it's the development approval, maybe it's a building permit, maybe it's occupancy certificates. But at some point, usually well before the building is built, or well before the building is operational, and well before we know if there's a performance gap, the influence of a policymaker drops away. And being able to use a tool like a commitment agreement that is sort of run externally, has a framework that sort of follows things up for multiple years after the building is complete and operating, really kind of extends the influence of a good policy and lets us sort of close the loop and get better outcomes for a longer period of time. So in terms of why get a commitment agreement, the key thing to me, I suppose, is that everyone here knows that there's a million pairs of hands a building will go through between sort of being an idea and an architect's brain through to being a functioning building with a facilities manager. And essentially, sustainability and energy performance are just not key KPIs for everybody along that process. So having a set target that's sort of easy to communicate is a really easy way, a really effective way to make sure that everybody throughout that process knows that there is a target, that the target will be verified, and that they've got a role in helping to meet the target, and that it's quite obvious, if they haven't done something and the target is missed. So it's just a really simple way to make sure that sustainability does stay as a key KPI throughout the process. Essentially, most NABERS ratings, or a lot of NABERS ratings, sorry, I should say, are voluntary. So there's a lot of benefit in them for building owners too. And just as an example, there's a lot of data that says you'll get more money per metre squared when you buy or sell if you've got a higher rating. We've often got lower vacancy rates and longer lease expiry. So we're sort of looking at more stable investments as well. So unsurprisingly, obviously, NABERS is working on a gap called Closing the Performance Gap. So this webinar series is obviously part of this project, but we do have a lot of other resources coming from it as well. So as a bit of background, we've been working with local and state governments to sort of understand what the issues in this space are and what people feel like they need and what's missing. And really interestingly, there were some really sort of common threads that came out throughout all these conversations. And one was that we were speaking to these incredible experts who were so knowledgeable in their fields, but they just didn't quite understand how sort of the separate fields around them worked and where the intersections and opportunities were. So we heard from planners that they just didn't fully understand sustainable buildings. They didn't fully understand the National Construction Code. We heard from sustainability professionals who just didn't understand how the planning system in their state works or where intersection with the building code was. And overwhelmingly, people really wanted training and education and sort of case studies on how all these things worked and what the opportunities were. The other really interesting finding is that when we first started speaking to people, we thought that we would be doing a project that sort of really led the way, showing this is how you get buildings to go above and beyond minimum standards. But a lot of the people we spoke to just said that, if we just could know that buildings were doing what that was supposed to do and that were complying with minimum standards, we'd be pretty happy. So that was really interesting. We just don't have the data. And sometimes we don't have the confidence to know that that's happening. So that's sort of been more a focus of this project, and then looking at voluntary ways to go above and beyond where it's appropriate as well. But based on all of this, we've got quite a few free resources. We've got some really in-depth online training. We've had some amazing feedback. So people are finding it really useful. And almost everyone has said that there's practical takeaways that they can go and implement tomorrow if they want to. So that's great. Obviously, we've got this webinar series. We've got a lot of case studies on the website. We've also provided example wording that you can use in policies to sort of close loopholes and get the outcomes that you're after. So really quickly, the online training, we looked at all the areas that people said that they were interested in learning more about. So we've looked at, net zero and why it's important in this space. We're looking at design versus performance. We're looking at how NABERS works, how the National Construction Code works, and what the planning system in your state is. So I should say that training is state-based, so it's very specific to opportunities within your planning system, the existing frameworks there. And of course, we've got this webinar series. So like I said, next up, we're looking at sustainability rating tools. We're co-hosting with the Green Building Council of Australia, who do Green Star ratings. We've both got some really cool examples, so hopefully you'll find that really interesting. Number 3, we're looking at New South Wales SEF as a case study in terms of how somebody else has looked at this and how they've solved it. And of course, number 4, we've got our practical session where hopefully you'll be able to come in, learn something and take it away as well. So I will wrap up there. Thank you very, very much for joining us. I really hope we'll see you at some of the later sessions as well. And we'll be around for about 15 minutes to answer questions if anybody's got any as well. Okay, so we've got a question from Ricardo. So is the fight against the performance gap significantly changing the approach to sub-metering and sensing at the design stage? And in the broader sector, out of the smart building and smart city circle? In that sector, yes, obviously, it absolutely is. Beyond that sector, the commercial building disclosure scheme that I looked at as case study number 1 has meant that sub-metering and sensing is probably a lot more common in that sector than other sectors because of those performance reporting obligations. So we do see a lot of sub-metering in the office sector outside the sort of typical smart building step that you might see. In broader sectors, it's really variable. So you do get leaders who are very interested in this. In the broader sector, I would say it's starting, but it may not be, where it could be yet. I can see that Ryan's answered a few questions as well already, so thank you, Ryan. But there's a lot of interesting research. Obviously, these 2 reports reference a lot of their studies as well, but we can link as well if you get in contact and you're interested. Absolutely. Look, we'll be around for a little bit longer, so if anybody does want to have a chat or ask something, we'll be here. You're very welcome if you think of something a bit later too to send an email to us. We're happy to have a chat or answer things via email too if that's of use. And yeah, hopefully we'll see some of you at future sessions.